First, let me introduce myself shortly. My name is Gosuke Miyashita. Sorry for hard to pronounce. And these are my Twitter account and GitHub account. I'm a freelance software engineer now, and mainly working at a company named Cookpad. Cookpad is real cooking recipe service company, not the server configuration recipe. And I'm from Japan, Kanagawa, which is red painted area next to Tokyo. And honestly, I'm a heavy Puppet user since 2007. This is a Japanese technical magazine. I wrote the article about Puppet. This was published at December 2007, about 7 years ago. And next, before main topic, let me talk about Chef in Japan. Chef is the most popular configuration management tool in Japan, very much popular than Puppet. This book, this Japanese book, Chef Practical Guide, will be published at this month. There are no Japanese original Puppet printed books published yet. So you can see how Chef is popular in Japan with this book. From here, I'm entering a main topic of my talk. First, I talk about overview of Serverspec. Does anyone know Serverspec? Oh, thank you. Does anyone use Serverspec? Oh, thank you very much. This is a website of Serverspec, and you can get enough information to use Serverspec from this site, serverspec.org. And this is the explanation of Serverspec on the website. RSpec is a Ruby testing framework, and Serverspec is a server testing tool based on RSpec. This is the sample test code by Serverspec. This code is checking the NGX web server package is installed, and NGX service is enabled, and NGX service is running. You don't need to care how to test it. For example, on Red Hat Linux, Serverspec uses RPM command to check package installed automatically. And on Ubuntu Linux, Serverspec uses dpkg command to test a package installed. And RSpec has some type of syntax, and expect syntax and should syntax. And I know expect syntax is recommended, but discussion about the RSpec syntax is out of my topic, so I won't touch about the syntax anymore. If you run the test code, you can see the result like this. This is a screenshot of test failed. NGX is not installed, so of course not enabled and not running. This is the screenshot of all tests succeeded. Return results turn into green like this. In the sample code I mentioned before, there are package and service type, and Serverspec supports these variety of types. I call these resource types. For example, C group type for checking C group parameter and value, and command type for checking the command execution results, and so on. Serverspec has many resource types. More description about each resource type and each sample code is here, this page. Please see this if you'd like to know more about resource types. Serverspec supports these OS distributions currently. All OS are not fully supported. And I'm using Centos mostly, so Red Hat-based OS are fully supported. But I don't use Windows, so Windows is least supported. Next, I talk about the mechanism of how to work Serverspec. Serverspec is very simple. Run commands via local shell if you try to test local machine by Serverspec. And if you try to test remote machines, Serverspec run command via SSH or WinRM if the target machine OS is Windows. So you don't need any other agent software. You don't need even Ruby and Serverspec on the target machine if you run Serverspec remotely. And I said Serverspec runs commands, but commands are different among each OS distributions. So Serverspec detects the OS on the target machine automatically and runs suitable command. This is the test result by Serverspec, checking whether NGINX package is installed or not. That fails. See the line surrounded by the orange line. This is the command that Serverspec run. This test run on the Red Hat-based Linux and use RPM command to check the package installed. If you run same test on the Ubuntu Linux, Serverspec runs a different command like this. In this screenshot, Serverspec run dpkg command. Serverspec handles this automatically. You don't need to care about it. Serverspec handles OS automatically, but we should specify how to run command by ourselves by including appropriate helper. This is a way to specify how to run commands. Serverspec has a helper command, Serverspec init. Serverspec init generates the template files for testing. This is the content of the file spec_helper.rb generated by Serverspec init. Detectors helper handles the difference among each OS, and exec helper used for the local execution. If you run the test to remote machine, you must include Specinfra helper SSH instead of exec. I call this helper backend helper. And I didn't explain about Specinfra. This appears for the first time in my talk. So I will explain about Specinfra next. Specinfra is a command execution framework separated from Serverspec. Originally, Serverspec includes a whole of these functions, but now separated into Serverspec and Specinfra. Most of the important functions are in Specinfra currently. And Serverspec wraps Specinfra by RSpec. I will explain why I separated into Serverspec and Specinfra. I've created a very simple configuration management tool as a proof of concept. That name is config-spec. It is on the GitHub repository. Sample code of config-spec is like this. This is same as Serverspec sample code, but Serverspec tests whether NGINX is installed or not by this code. On the other hand, config-spec install NGINX package with this code. I made a config-spec for some kind of a proof concept and for half-jokingly. The original config-spec code mostly copied from Serverspec. So my friend said you should extract the common functions as another Ruby gem So I separated Specinfra from Serverspec and released as another Ruby gem. If you use Specinfra, you can create another type of Serverspec. For example, if you don't like RSpec, you can create a Minitest-based Serverspec. Minitest is another Ruby testing framework. Or your original Serverspec that has original domain-specific language that different from Serverspec and Minitest. Please try it if you like. But Specinfra brings more complexity. Because of Specinfra, Serverspec code become difficult to read and test code. So if other software based on Specinfra will not appear in the future, I may integrate Serverspec and Specinfra into one product again for easiness to code maintenance. Next, I talk about the reason why I started to make Serverspec. I said in the first of my talk, I'm a heavy Puppet user. And my old Puppet manifests are not fully modularized, so became legacy code. And one day, I thought I need my Puppet manifest refactored. And in the world of software development, refactoring needs test code. This is also applicable to the configuration management. But there are no testing tools meet my needs. So I made my own testing tool, that is Serverspec. I'd like to talk about my philosophy about Serverspec. Most important thing is simpleness. I'm trying to keep Serverspec simple as much as I can. And this is also important, and I'd like Serverspec to be used by many people widely. So I'm trying to keep Serverspec to use easily. For easiness to use, Serverspec supports Ruby 1.8.7 because Red-Hat-based Linux default Ruby version is 1.8.7. And if Serverspec supports only higher than Ruby 1.9 and need to install Ruby, which package is not distributed by OS vendor, there may be people giving up to use Serverspec. I'd like to avoid that, so Serverspec supports Ruby 1.8.7. And this thing is also important for easiness to use. If you must install so many software to use Serverspec, you may quit using Serverspec. And you don't need even Ruby on the target machine if you run Serverspec remotely. This also helps easiness to use. And for easiness to use, Serverspec is independent from any configuration management tools. If Serverspec supports only Chef, I can't use Serverspec because I'm a Puppet user. On the other hand, if Serverspec supports only Puppet, Chef users don't have interest in Serverspec, and I'm not here to talk about Serverspec. I love the UNIX philosophy, KISS principle, keep it simple. So I'm developing Serverspec based on this principle. Next, I will talk about advanced topics related to Serverspec. First advanced topic is how to customize. To know how to customize, please see this page and GitHub repository. There are many sample code to customize. Next advanced topic is combination with other tools. I told that I try to keep Serverspec simple as much as I can. Because of its simpleness, it is easy to combine other tools with Serverspec. The first example is Test Kitchen. There may be some people using Test Kitchen with Serverspec. Does anyone use Test Kitchen with Serverspec? Oh, thank you. Test Kitchen has a Busa Serverspec plugin to combine with Serverspec. Original author of Busa Serverspec is Japanese, and one of the authors of the book, Japanese book, Shape Practical Guide. See the official Test Kitchen document how to use with Serverspec. You can understand easily with this document. One more example is Vagrant. Vagrant has Vagrant Serverspec plugin for using with Serverspec. This is the example usage on GitHub Vagrant Serverspec repository. In the provisioning sequence of Vagrant, you can run Serverspec testing if you write the code like this in the Vagrant file. See the detail about Vagrant Serverspec on this GitHub repository. But there are things to care if you use Vagrant Serverspec. This is a gemspec file of Vagrant Serverspec. It depends on Serverspec version under 0.12.0. It's very old, so you must fix this if you'd like to use Vagrant Serverspec. And one more thing, Vagrant Serverspec returns exit code 0, even though test failed. So you should fix it before using this plugin. The last topic is about the integration test of Serverspec itself. Serverspec and Specinfra have their own test code, but test code uses a mock and don't actually run the test code on the machines. To keep Serverspec reliable, the actual running tests on the variety of OS are needed. So I've created this GitHub repository. With this actual test, I'm using Worker. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's one of the continuous integration service. And I'm using DigitalOcean to create the virtual machines for testing. This shows how to work the integration test of Serverspec. When I put the code of Serverspec or Specinfra, or someone make a pull request, Worker pulls the code from GitHub and create virtual machines on DigitalOcean. Then run Chef Solo and Serverspec tests on the virtual machine, and Worker gets the test result. This shows how the test results look like on Worker. The test in the bottom failed, so I fixed, and next the test succeeded. This integration test supports currently only Centos version 6 and has a few Serverspec test code. So now I'm working on increase support OS and increase test code. To keep Serverspec more reliable, now I'm working on this thing. And that's it, very quick. This is the end of my slide. Thanks for listening to my talk.